Should we begin? Oh, sorry.
Well, thank you. Well, we're ready.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here as we discuss the rather controversial issue of carbon taxes. We're pleased to welcome Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schatz, who will introduce their carbon tax bill. I'm Aparna Mathur. I'm a resident scholar in economic policy studies here at AEI. The bill aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce the rate of corporate income tax, provide tax credits to workers, and deliver additional benefits to retired and disabled persons. Before I turn the floor over to the two senators, and we're sorry we're doing this in a sort of rushed manner. I think the senators need to get back for voting. Let me just say that at AEI, we believe in the competition of ideas, which in this particular context means that while we welcome the senators and are open to being a platform for debate on this issue, this is not an endorsement of any particular policy or position. AEI has no institutional positions. As scholars, we're free to take opposing points of view. I have written extensively on carbon taxes and corporate tax reform and combining the two. My colleague Benjamin Zeiker has opposed everything that I've written on carbon taxes and disagrees completely with me. Unfortunately, he is not here today, but we have a panel following the remarks by the two senators, and I hope some of that diversity will come through. So let me just turn over the podium to Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I appreciate your accommodating our schedule. As you know, we have some rather consequential votes happening in the Senate this afternoon. I am truly delighted that the American Enterprise Institute has once again launched the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. I thank my partner in this effort, Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii, and thank you to the staff of American Enterprise Institute and to Dr. Aparna Mathur and the panelists for being here to discuss our proposal. Virtually every person on the Republican side who has thought the climate change problem through to a solution has come to the same place. Price carbon emissions to encourage cleaner energy and return the revenue to the American people. Former Treasury Secretaries Baker, Schultz, and Paulson, former EPA administrators Ruckelshaus, Thomas, Riley, and Whitman, leading economists and former presidential economic advisors Arthur Laffer, Gregory Mankiw, and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and many others, support a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon fee. Well, that's what we do. You all know what the phrase olive branch means. Former Republican Congressman Bob Inglis described our proposal as an olive limb, not a branch, in pairing a carbon tax with corporate tax reduction and, he said, an opportunity for conservatives to show how free enterprise can solve climate change. When I first came to the Senate in 2007, the place was humming with bipartisan action on climate change for years. But in 2010, dead stop. The Republican Party disappeared from the field after the fossil fuel industry secured, from 5 justices on the Supreme Court, the disgraceful Citizens United decision. The fossil fuel industry immediately launched a veritable Soviet May Day parade of political artillery. No special interest had that kind of political muscle before Citizens United. The combination of this industry political weaponry, plus the proliferation of dark money, plus the shady science simulacrum of climate denial has been formidable. But despite this, there's room for optimism. There are Republicans willing to work with us, and not just a few. They just need some prospect of safe passage through the political kill zone the fossil fuel industry has created. Over 1,000 American companies voiced their support for the Paris Climate Agreement, including corporate powerhouses like Walmart, Goldman Sachs, PepsiCo, and Google. If American companies were to mobilize in Congress like they did for the Paris Agreement, it would be a game changer. But notwithstanding all that corporate support, the big business trade associations and lobbying groups have lined up against action on climate change. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is one of climate action's most implacable enemies, despite the good climate policies of so many of its member companies. The American Petroleum Institute represents Shell, BP, Total, and Exxon, companies that claim to support the Paris Agreement and the Climate Leadership Council's carbon fee proposal, but API opposes anything getting done. Corporate America commands extraordinary attention in our political system. If American corporations align their political engagement on climate change with their actual position on climate change, we can get going. So in a spirit of hopefulness, Senator Schatz and I are reintroducing the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act, a framework I hope both Republicans and Democrats can embrace. The bill would establish an economy-wide carbon fee on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, assessed where it is easiest to administer, minimizing the compliance burden. Other greenhouse gas emissions would be tied to their carbon dioxide equivalency with a bumper for fluorocarbons. Sequestering, utilizing, or encapsulating carbon dioxide would earn you a credit. The market would begin to work in this space. Our bill sets the 2018 fee per ton of carbon emitted at $49, the central range of the social cost of carbon last estimated by the Office of Management and Budget. That fee would increase each year at a real 2% until emissions fall 80% below 2005 levels and then follow inflation. Border adjustments for energy-intensive goods traded with countries that have weaker or no carbon pricing will make sure we protect our industries at home. We took care to design the border adjustments in harmony with World Trade Organization rules. This carbon fee would produce meaningful reductions in emissions. The Nonpartisan Resources for the Future projects a 36% drop by 2025 compared to the benchmark year of 2005, exceeding the U.S. Paris Agreement commitment significantly. In addition to the environmental value, of course, the carbon fee also generates revenue, in this case nearly $2.1 trillion over 10 years. Our plan would return every dime to the American people. Here's how. First, the bill lowers the top corporate income tax rate from 35% to 29%. This would cut American corporate taxes by almost $600 billion over the first decade. Second, it provides workers with a $550 refundable tax credit, $1,100 per couple, against payroll taxes. The tax credits, which would grow with inflation, would return almost $900 billion to American households over the first 10 years. Third, it would provide a matching benefit to Social Security recipients, Veterans Program beneficiaries, and certain other retirees. These benefits would total nearly $500 billion over 10 years. Finally, the bill would establish a block grant program delivering the remaining funds to the states, over $100 billion to help workers in coal country or provide coastal protection for seaside states, at the discretion of the state to meet local needs and concerns. I understand the suffering in coal country. Coal country will continue to decline as natural gas drives coal out of the energy markets. There is no present mechanism now to remedy that inevitability. Remember Huey Long's old slogan, every man a king? With a carbon fee, we could make every miner a king. A solid pension, retirement at any time, full health benefits for life, a cash bonus based on years' work, a voucher for a new vehicle, a college plan for their kids. These things become doable with carbon fee revenues. It is not the miners' fault that the coal industry has collapsed. They worked hard. They did dangerous work. It is a rigorous occupation to be a coal miner, and miners are entitled to respect. Give them their dignity, make them kings. With a small fraction of the revenue from a carbon fee, we could assure every single coal miner a lifetime of comfort and financial stability. Senator Schatz and I extend an open hand, an olive limb. Find Senator Schatz and me a Republican to negotiate with. Then let's talk about the economics, let's talk about the revenue, And because I know it's a part of the Baker-Schultz proposal, let's talk about where we can get fact-based, scientifically rigorous analytics of which regulations might become unnecessary or duplicative of a carbon fees emission reductions. Let's restart the bipartisan conversation. Let me close with an appeal to our patriotic sense. America holds herself out as an exemplary nation, a city on a hill. The tactics of climate denial and political menace that the fossil fuel industry deploys have degraded the city on the hill. There is a remorseless functioning of the laws of physics, of chemistry, and of biology. Time will tell. But everyone, from our Secretary of Defense to whoever you are, your home state's state university, understands and is warning that climate change is real and urgent. The longer our American democracy lies incapacitated, the worse the outcome will be. And the worse the outcome, the greater the harm to a country that holds its example to the world. John McCain returned to the Senate yesterday and called our country the strong, inspiring, inspirational beacon of liberty and defender of dignity of all human beings. Some beacon if we continue to get this wrong because of what one industry did to our politics. Thank you very, very much, and I call on my aloha friend, Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I want to thank AEI for hosting this important event today. I know the researchers are split on this idea, but what I really appreciate about AEI is that you maintain your conservative credentials without being monolithic in your views, and we certainly need more of that in this country, and that's why we're announcing our legislation here. This event is one of many examples of how AEI is a place for serious debate. This is what Washington should be doing. We should discuss ideas. We need more organizations, left, right, and center, to follow your lead and become a place for the real debate of public policy. I'm hoping that since you're here today, you believe that climate change is something that government actually needs to be concerned about, and that there is a role for public policy to play. We can't properly start a conversation about this idea without acknowledging that our planet is in crisis, and that as the indispensable nation, America has a unique responsibility to future generations to act. I believe that a price on carbon is the best option for a bipartisan solution. And it's one of the best options we have for tackling climate change, full stop. It is straightforward, it is simple. Companies pay a fee based on the emissions they're responsible for, and frankly, if I do say so myself, our bill is quite elegant. By assessing the fee as far upstream as we do, the bill ensures that we are able to address nearly all greenhouse gas emissions, and the idea is quite simple. Unleash markets to tackle climate change. It establishes incentives that allow capital to flow and businesses to thrive when they can use clean energy, letting the free market compete and innovate and make profits. So we're not telling anybody to reduce carbon. We're saying emit all the carbon you want, but you have to pay the costs of your actions rather than pushing that burden onto society as a whole. Here's another reason why conservatives ought to care about this idea. Putting a price on carbon does not expand the regulatory state. There will not be an office created at EPA or anywhere else to manage this. It relies on the market to do the work while creating revenue and predictability. And that predictability makes a difference for utilities, manufacturers, and anyone else that needs to make long-term infrastructure investments. Companies need certainty, and one of the main reasons for a carbon fee is to settle this thing once and for all. It is challenging to make investment choices in the private sector when you're subjugated to the idiosyncrasies of presidential politics. They faced the Clean Power Plan in Paris, and now there's no Clean Power Plan and no Paris, and that may change yet again in short order. But companies must plan beyond 4-year election cycles. A law enacted by Congress is much more certain than an executive order or an administration action that can be either not enforced or overturned by the courts. But don't take my word for it, not that you would. corporate America is organizing for this very reason. Oil companies, big name brands have joined together to support a carbon tax proposal by the Climate Leadership Council. Last month, they published a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal in support of carbon pricing. And one of the top benefits they cited was predictability for the private sector. They are part of a growing group that is supportive outside of your traditional democratic circles for carbon pricing. And there are more and more conservatives who think it's a good idea, from Kevin Hassett to James Baker to Art Laffer, a member of Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board, has made the case that you don't even have to care about climate change to support carbon pricing. In 2008, he said, all we need to assume is that burning less fossil fuels would be a good thing. Greg Mankiw from George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors has advocated for carbon pricing for more than a decade. He says that the sooner we deal with climate change, the less it is going to cost us. And the good news is that we do have a window of opportunity through tax reform. I don't have to tell all of you that both politically and fiscally, tax reform is fraught. It's tough. Republicans currently don't have a source of revenue that will get a majority of the votes in the House and the Senate. We're hearing a border adjustment tax, we're hearing a value-added tax, we're hearing eliminate the mortgage interest deduction. What voters hear is a tax on groceries, is a tax on their mortgage. These are both bad economic ideas in my view, but even if you think they're good ideas, they will not be enacted. There is no revenue for tax reform right now. And I know how crazy this sounds, but I want you to know that what is more politically palatable than taxing your groceries in order to reduce the top corporate income tax rate is taxing carbon pollution. This is true left, right, and center. And so when they find themselves in that cul-de-sac looking for revenue to reform the tax code, this may be a place that they turn to. And here's the brilliant aspect of it. It will win the support of voters. It will also win the support of Democrats. I think it is safe to say that you could not find another proposal that would reduce the top corporate income tax rates that Sheldon Whitehouse and I would whip for. And this is an important aspect of understanding, if we're trying to get to a conservative solution set on climate, that this is the pathway, Our bill raises more than $2 trillion over 10 years, which is way more than any of the terribly unpalatable and untenable proposals that are currently being considered. So if you want to create room for broad-based tax reform, this is the way to do it on a bipartisan basis. Carbon pricing will go a long way in paying for lower taxes on corporate income or anything else. So politically and fiscally, this is sound policy and needs to be included in the conversation this fall. With carbon pricing, we have a window to give certainty to the energy industry, give a reprieve to the climate, and give Republicans some revenue to get tax reform done. The only thing we're missing is an elected Republican or two to get on the bill. And we're hoping that with your support and with a conversation in this place and in this town, we can make that happen together. I do want to end by saying that climate change is a real problem that deserves serious consideration from conservatives. There are some issues in this town that Democrats are happy to own exclusively, where it's just not realistic for the parties to come together because of deep philosophical differences, but the desire to save the planet for our children and grandchildren cannot be the exclusive domain of one political party. And there is a rich tradition in the United States of conservative environmentalism. So if carbon pricing isn't your preferred solution, fine. I'd like to hear any ideas that you may have, but let's get serious about tackling this problem as Americans. We have to find a way forward together. It's my hope that tax reform is the window that we've been looking for. Thank you for the opportunity. I think Sheldon and I are going to now be open to questions for about, how much time do we have? 10 minutes? 5. I'm being told 5.
All right, when his hand goes up, we have to
We're going to literally run.
Pull the eject cord.
Okay,
You got us until then.
Let's take a question. Oh, we have a microphone coming.
Hi, thanks, Lisa Friedman from the New York Times. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, question on the revenues and where that's going to go. Senator Whitehouse, the U.S. has stopped giving money now to the Green Climate Fund. Both of you and other Democrats have expressed concern about that. Assuming this measure passed, why not give a portion of that money to countries that have done little or nothing to contribute to emissions, but are facing consequences and now are not going to be addressed, at least from the U.S. by the Climate Fund?
Morally, there would be no reason not to, in my estimation. But my purpose in designing this law was to try to find a sweet spot that made it as politically palatable as it could be. So hence the corporate income tax reductions, not always my prime topic. Hence the protection for people who are at the lower economic levels and might see pricing impacts in their lives, and hence at least the invitation, I would call it, to look at local concerns and figure out a way to solve them in this bill so that John Barrasso does not have to go home to a Wyoming that is looking at losing a third of its state revenues if there's a complete crash in carbon revenues in Wyoming, so that Shelley Moore Capito can go home to West Virginia and have something really to make her coal miners stand and cheer, so that people who are on the coasts of Rhode Island and Hawaii suddenly have some revenue to deal with the horrifying impacts that our states are currently predicting for our shores. That's the package, and the fewer things that we can put into it that create additional drama or additional political drag, the better. This is a big problem, and we can't bog down its solution in the solution to a lot of other problems that would be nice, but we can't have the big solution be a sacrifice to small benefits, I guess would be the way I'd say that.
We want to get to 60. That's my summary.
He said it much more efficiently.
We can do one more question at the back. Oh, could you wait for the microphone, please?
Right behind you is the mic, sir.
Thank you.
If Congress is going to take responsibility for greenhouse emissions, are you going to be willing to take that power away from the EPA as part of this legislation?
So, look, I think we need a Republican first before we have a real negotiation. And I think we'd be unwise to have a negotiation mic'd up with the media present. But suffice it to say that I think that there's an opportunity for a negotiation similar to what happened with Waxman-Markey and other pieces of legislation where people understand, as I said, that a carbon fee, in my remarks, that a carbon fee does not increase the jurisdiction of any regulatory agency, and on that level it's attractive to conservatives. So I think that's a conversation for a later time. And but I think it's also unwise to negotiate with an unnamed dance partner.
And let me just reemphasize the point that I made in my remarks. When we get there, it's going to be very important to have a trusted source of information, and people who want us to get there ought to be working on that project, whether it's Resources for the Future or a twinning of CAP and AEI or the Energy Information Institute or something else. We're going to need information in that conversation. It should not be just a political conversation. It should be as fact-based as our solution to climate change.
We can do one more.
You can.
We want to do one more.
We see
This may be an error, but we'll take one more.
We're happy for you.
Hi, my name is Elvina. I'm a reporter with CQ Roll Call. As you mentioned, you need a dance partner. Short of introducing a bill where you are minority, do you have a broader plan to try to sell it across the aisle? And any chance you can name any names of any Republicans that might come on board?
Not yet. Look, we are in multiple productive conversations with Republicans in both chambers, and we think that we're making progress. But I think that progress might stop if we gave you a bunch of names.
But the number is, I would put it 6 to 10, and I would say that if you got the first tranche of between 6 and 10, you'd find another 6 to 10 who are ready to become a part of that party but didn't want to be the lead cohort.
Thank you so much.
Before we wrap up, I just want to really thank you and AEI. We did this a couple of years ago.
That's right.
It's an incredible organization in terms of your professionalism, and we understand that not everybody agrees with our point of view, but I think it's just an extraordinary example for the country that we can come in here and have an adult conversation about a very tough issue. We really appreciate it.
We really
Agreed.
appreciate your being here. Thank you so much.
That's the step.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to turn over to our panel. So I would invite our panelists to come on stage now.
Oh. I mean, I'm so not an expert on this. Hi. Oh, very nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you. It's very nice to meet you.
Great, so we're going to straight away jump into our reactions to the Senator's bill. We have an extremely great group of panelists here. Let me quickly introduce them. You'll find their longer bios in the material that you have or you would have gotten outside. We will begin with Veronique DeRougy. Veronique is a senior research fellow at the Mokatis Center at George Mason University and a nationally syndicated columnist. Veronique was at AEI when I first joined AEI. She's the author of...
I still make your curry. She has a great recipe.
Thank you. Is the author of a weekly opinion column for Creators Syndicate, writes regular columns for Reason magazine, and blogs about economics at National Review Online's The Corner. George Frampton is a co-founder of the Partnership for Responsible Growth, a nonprofit advocacy organization that is building broad-based public support for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. From 2009 to 2013, he was senior counsel at Covington and Burling in the firm's climate and clean energy practice. Myron Ebel is director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment, which advocates for free market environmentalism. He also chairs the Cooler Heads Coalition. And finally, Adele Morris is a senior fellow and policy director for climate and energy economics at the Brookings Institution. Her expertise and interests include economics of policies related to climate change, energy, and public finance. So I welcome all of you, and I'm going to start with Veronique, just your initial reactions to the idea and your thoughts on a carbon tax in general.
So first I'd like to say, because I think it's in this climate, it's important to say that being skeptical about the proposal put forward doesn't say anything about being a climate denier or anything. I think it's important to say this. And I come to this as an economist and as one who's trained in public choice economics. And as such, I'm highly skeptical of the ability of government to actually do, first to set the right targets for itself, but also to achieve, even when those targets are correct, to achieve those goals because of the incentives and the dynamic within government and the pressure from interest groups and so on and so forth. And so when I hear these proposals, first I'd like to I went and looked a little bit at the numbers, and I was thinking it's interesting that there's such a push for a carbon tax emission at a time where actually carbon emission is at a 20-year low. And if you adjust it for population, it has never been as low since the 1959, which shows that there's actually a real shift that's happening independently of the policies that are put in place, and maybe some of it is due to policy put in place, but certainly not a carbon tax policy put in place, and a shift from coal to natural gas. And so you've got to kind of wonder, like, why are we doing this now? The other thing that's important to talk about is, like, again, it is important that the policy put in place achieves a goal, right? And here the assumption is you put in place a tax. And I was surprised to hear the congressman say you can produce as much carbon as you want, you have to pay a price. But I mean, really, the goal is like the extra price will mean you will produce less carbon emission, and then so I'm zero substitute for Ben Zeiger at AI, but from everything I've read from him is like it is really questionable that actually these type of carbon tax based on EPA models will lead to a significant or at all reduction in temperatures in the 2100s. So you have to kind of wonder about this. Then you have to ask, who's going to be shouldering the burden of the tax, right? Because there's like the people writing the check, but then they're not always the one shouldering it. Awesome research by Aparna has shown, for instance, for the corporate income tax, that a lot of that tax is actually not shouldered by corporation, but by workers in the form of lower wages. Well, the same can be true about a carbon tax imposed on corporations. And so you'll have some of it lower wages for workers, and other part was like higher prices for consumers, lower dividend for investors, which then leads to lower investment. This will have a cost. So if you have not a lot of benefits or no benefits and a lot of cost, not necessarily shouldered by the people we think are shouldering it, that causes a problem. And then I will talk about another thing that actually really gives me pause about this proposal. And it's like, if indeed the proposal does reduce carbon emission, right? Then the revenue should go away over time. And yet, that revenue is already earmarked for spending, for new entitlements, for Social Security, we heard, but for a dividend for Americans. Now, here you go, you've created immediately, based on a revenue that should be winding down over time, an interest groups that politicians are going to be beholden to continue, paying this dividend to. And then you've created a new, I don't want to say entitlement because it's not necessarily an entitlement, but you've created a new government expectation of a payout based on a revenue that should be winding down. So this is a problem, and then I want to give enough time for my co-panelists, but there's also the talks of a border adjusted tax, which have been fighting with the Republicans for a while. But I mean, there's really no doubt that this has the potential of creating a real strengthening of the protectionist sentiments that already exist, with a price, again, to pay on consumers. So I will stop there with these, and we can, talk more about it.
We'll get back to you. Yes. So next I have George, your reactions to the bill. And
well, is this on?
Yes.
People hear me? I would say we think that there is going to be a serious national debate, congressional debate this fall in the context of tax reform about the benefits of an upstream carbon fuel fee like that described in the bill. And that really has more to do with the revenue it produces than it does about climate change, and maybe something to do with the fact that it's attractive to people who are skeptical of government getting it right and would rather see the market operate than command and control regulation. And just to describe this very simply, current publicly held debt is $14 trillion. The business as usual projections are that will go in the next 10 years without any reduction in tax rates for anybody, with no tax reform, to $24 trillion. That's far above the historical debt to GDP ratio we experienced after World War II. And that's with no tax reform. The House blueprint plan for tax reform, which at a cost of $4 or $5 more trillion, had only two pay-fors. One was a border adjustment tax that was supposed to produce $1.3 trillion over 10 years. And the other is the repeal of the business interest deduction, which was supposed to produce another $1 trillion over 10 years, $2.3 trillion. The bad is dead, the interest deduction is dying. So that looks like a $3 or $4 trillion hole. The administration so far has taken the position that it's not going to propose any pay-fors. So one way or another, when we come to tax reform, if Republicans want to do something and the administration wants to do something, anything that grows the economy by way of tax reform, they're looking at a $3 or $4 trillion, $5 trillion hole. Nothing produces any new revenue like a carbon fee. So Treasury, CBO, JTC have scored over the last 6 months, including the Whitehouse Schatz bill. various levels of a carbon fee. So a $25 per metric ton of CO2 carbon fee produces about $1 trillion over 10 years. A $49 carbon fee produces 2.1 or $2.2 trillion over 10 years. Nothing else that has been suggested. We've done 170 Hill visits in the last 4 months. Not a single member of Congress has suggested another pay-for that produces even 1/10 of that revenue. So is that regressive? Will that raise energy prices? Yes, but 50% of the money basically will keep about the bottom 70% of families whole. That leaves $1 trillion to play with. That $1 trillion will actually get the corporate tax rate from 35 to 25% without any other sacrifices from tax reform. So using carbon fee revenues for tax reform does 3 things that Republicans want, that the administration wants, and that a lot of the business community wants, that probably can't be achieved any other way. One is permanent, long-term, serious tax reform that gets tax rates down and still protects low and middle income families, grows the economy, creates jobs, makes companies more competitive. So that's one thing. Second is a template for deregulation, because Congress is not going to do any kind of permanent, serious deregulation without some offset. And deregulation done administratively by the executive branch is going to be slow, ugly, and it's not going to be permanent. And both business and Republicans want some kind of permanent deregulation. And third, a carbon fee proposal is going to come along with a border adjustment for imports from countries that don't put a similar price on carbon that can be made WTO compliant. So to the extent that there's a current widespread interest on the part of President Trump or Republicans in Congress on a border adjustment, carbon fee gives you a WTO compliant border adjustment. So those are 3 things you can't get any other way, and we think that's going to be, a reasonably persuasive reason to have a debate about this if there's a serious debate about tax reform. It may be there won't be a serious debate about tax reform. Predicting what Congress is going to do these days is impossible. But if there's a serious debate about tax reform, there's going to have to be a serious debate about a carbon fee. If you're not concerned about climate change, you're not concerned about risk mitigation, you don't think we should be doing anything about this, or you don't even think that it's a serious problem, you should be for this program solely on fiscal grounds and economic grounds. It happens to produce a virtually free insurance policy against escalating costs of climate change in case you're wrong. Because if you're a climate denier but you're wrong, the costs are going to be astronomical. This is the insurance policy that makes sure that you're protected against that. So we think that debate's going to happen. It's going to be new, it's going to be interesting, and it's going to be complicated. But, and I'm premising that proposition to you on the grounds that it has very little to do with climate change at all.
Myron.
Well, George, there's something I agree with. It does have nothing to do with climate change. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, AEI, for inviting me here today. I'm sorry that Ben Zeiker couldn't be here. When he couldn't be here, he invited my colleague Marla Lewis, who's on holiday, so I'm a very poor substitute for either one of them.
Even the 2 of us together are
for Ben, yes. Well, I very seldom get to speak at academic events. I usually speak at political events, but despite the appearance of Senators Whitehouse and Schatz, this is an entirely academic event because their bill is dead on arrival. It's dead even before they introduce it. And let me just say why that's so. There have been many attempts to have blandishments to conservatives in Congress to support a carbon tax or some other energy rationing regime. I would remind you in Waxman-Markey in 2009 and 10, the argument that we were given by many corporations was, well, you can't beat something with nothing. So you've got to, so Exxon said we need a carbon tax proposal because we can't beat cap and trade without it. Well, that proved to be wrong. In 2010, the Democrats lost control of the House, largely because they voted for cap and trade. The Senate did not go Republican because Harry Reid was clever enough not to have a vote on cap and trade. Mr. Bob Inglis will be forever known as Mr. 7029. He lost his re-election primary 70% to 29% as an incumbent. Then we were told by political savants such as Jerry Taylor that we needed to have a carbon tax and trade it for the various regulations that were being instituted by the Obama administration without any congressional action. We were told that because otherwise we would never get rid of these regulations. This was our only chance. And Jerry Taylor, in fact, said last March that, well, we had to work very quickly because, of course, Trump was going to lose overwhelmingly and the Republicans would lose both the House and the Senate. Well, the regulations are now disappearing because President Trump is withdrawing them. So what is the reason for a carbon tax? Let me give one more political point. The Republicans in the House held a test vote on a carbon tax last year. They had a resolution. Not a single Republican voted for that resolution. Now, if George said that this doesn't have anything much to do with climate change, I agree with that. If the goal is to avoid 2 degrees centigrade of warming, given the temperature history of the past 30 years, we are already on track to do that. Even though global emissions keep going up, even though Chinese emissions are now double those of the United States. So what is a carbon tax for? Well, in my view, it's all pain and no gain. In George Frampton's view, for example, it's a new source, a colossal new source of revenue. But in fact, when Senator Whitehouse talked, he said we're going to give it all back to the people. So where is that a gain? Of course, in federal revenue. One of the things that's not talked about are what we could broadly call the tax interaction effects. When government raises revenue, raises taxes, it depresses economic activity, and therefore the government loses tax revenue somewhere else. If you look at the OMB's analytics of their budget, they have an interesting table called Sensitivity of the Budget to Economic Assumptions. And I think you will see that the kind of hit that a carbon tax would do on the economy, a one-time hit, the amount of revenue that will be lost because of lower economic activity over the next decade is actually larger than the amount of revenue that will be raised. Now, Ross McKittrick is the guy who's done the most on this. He's talked about the marginal costs of public revenue. And I don't have the statistics for the various states, but the provinces that he's looked at in Canada, for every dollar raised by a carbon tax in Alberta, it will cost $1.4, as I recall. In Ontario, it will cost $6. So this is, again, all pain and no gain. The whole game is to convince conservatives that this is a, quote, free market solution, that it will give all the money back to people, and according to Senator Schatz, will not increase the regulatory state. How is that possible? First of all, you have to create a whole new system to send people their checks and make sure you're sending it to the right people every year, their rebate checks. You paid in all this money and now you're going to get some of it back. You're not going to get all of it back. Well, I might get all of it back. I have a low carbon lifestyle, right? I take the metro to work every day, subsidized by taxpayers. It's a low carbon means of transportation. But if I lived in Iowa, or from where I'm from in Eastern Oregon, I would have to have a big pickup truck in my job. I would be heavily carbon intensive, and that check I got back every year would not begin to cover my carbon emissions. And by the way, those are the people who produce stuff. The carbon intensive people are the people who make stuff, grow stuff, and dig up stuff. I just manipulate stuff in front of a computer screen all day. Well, I don't even do that all day. So I would just conclude by saying that this bill should give everyone pause as to the kinds of games that are played in Washington by people who have an insatiable desire to increase the size, the scope of government, and the revenues that it takes out of the economy. I think once conservatives look at this bill, they will come to the same conclusion that they did the last time this bill was introduced, which is keep that as far away from us as possible. Thank you.
Adele.
Thank you. And thank you, Aparna, and to the American Enterprise Institute. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, not least because I was invited by Aparna, who is a dear friend and treasured co-author, but also a fabulous scholar. I highly recommend her scholarly work to you, and it's a deep pleasure to be here. I want to start by making the affirmative case to Republicans why they should reach out to this olive limb. I think that's exactly the right way to describe it. And you know, it might conflict a little bit with what you've heard so far, but I think really there is a case to be made for a deal here. And Republicans should think about this bill as a way to achieve other goals, even if they're not highly energized on the climate issue. There are, as we've heard before, there's the potential for tax reform, regulatory changes, and you know, you could link it to infrastructure spending if that's what you want to do. I think it gives Republicans an opportunity for a productive stance on a topic of critical issues for both Republicans and Democrats, whether it's tax reform or climate change or both. I think Republicans desperately need to establish a productive stance on something and a bipartisan relationship on a topic of interest to the American people. The issue's not going to go away, right? So you might say, oh, well, we've beaten back this attempt or that attempt at legislation. But I'm just going to incorporate by reference the finding of the National Academies of Sciences and every major scientific organization on the face of the earth. Climate change is a risk, and it needs to be managed, and we should be in the business of talking about how to do that in the most economically responsible way possible. And that's what I think this bill opens that conversation, and this is an opportunity for Republicans to engage. And if we don't have action at the federal level, let's just play this out for a second. State and local governments are already taking action. This action will proliferate, and this will be, however well-intentioned, intrinsically less cost-effective than a coherent federal solution. It will not allow for border adjustments on carbon-intensive goods. It won't allow for harmonized market signals across different states and sectors. It's not going to provide the same incentives for innovation and lowering the cost of achieving these goals. And diplomatically, frankly, state and local efforts are limited in how much they can leverage domestic action internationally. And states are going to be increasingly invested in these policies, and if Republicans wait, states are going to be, these are going to be harder to unravel, and it's going to become more difficult to have a coherent federal solution, which is really what we need, economy-wide measures. There will be continued litigation by the environmental groups, children's groups. We're seeing that already. That will gain steam. It is already gaining steam. And there's also going to be continued pressure on corporations from attorneys general and shareholders and investor groups and activist organizations and regulators and financial institutions. What are you doing about climate change? Where's your risk analysis? How are you managing your risks associated with climate. If we had a coherent federal policy, all of those energies will dissipate tremendously. There will be continued foreign policy blowback. Look, our withdrawal from Paris carried real diplomatic damages. Do not misunderstand that. And I don't think eroding our relationships with important allies is smart foreign policy. And we can engage, and we can do it productively, and we better get going. The next Democrat in the White House, we're going to see another reversal into the regulatory realm if we don't do something now. I mean, Republicans control the Congress and the White House. This is their opportunity to negotiate from strength. Next time the Democrats come in, they're going to be negotiating from a position of weakness, and they're going to face the son of the Clean Power Plan and more regulatory measures across different sectors. It's going to again be state by state, sector by sector, and far less efficient and cost effective than the kind of solution that the senators are offering in this bill. And the impulse, and actually the economic case, will be to make up for lost time and make those policies that much more stringent. Again, the Clean Air Act is a diplomatically inferior tool. It's hard to leverage Section 111D into the international community and make some sense of it as part of our foreign policy. And you know that the next administration is going to try to use even more of the authorities within the Clean Air Act. It's not just going to be Section 111. It's going to be Section 115, and who all knows what other issues people are going to try to unearth from the potential authorities. And all that litigation is going to just reemerge, and it's going to take years. And that's really not the way to steward the American economy. So, finally, I would say, Republicans, if you don't participate in this issue, you are going to start owning natural disasters. The science of attributing these extreme weather events to climatic disruption and the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is advancing every day. And before long, we're going to have droughts in the Midwest and Superstorm Sandy type events, and you are going to own those because you did not take action when you had the opportunity. So that's my message to the Republicans. So now let me talk about this bill specifically. There are a lot of really important design decisions in this bill that I think can appeal to conservatives and are very well supported by the peer-reviewed economic literature. Number one, we've got clear, predictable, transparent price signals. Every economist who works in this area thinks this is the way to go about do it. Because what are you doing? You're harnessing the profit motive. You're inducing innovation and capital deployment in service to emissions reductions. There's no more efficient way to go about this. It's comprehensive coverage across sectors and sources and states, and it covers the vast majority of greenhouse gases, and it provides refunds for carbon capture and storage and carbon embodied in products that's not emitted. Of course, you want to incentivize that. It's designed to be administratively efficient. We're talking about minimizing the number of actual taxpayers in this bill, and I think that's well designed. Now, let's talk about the price trajectory for a second. It goes up over inflation. This is really important because you want to maintain your emissions reduction even as the economy grows. They're starting at $49. This is ambitious. There's no two ways about it. This will achieve whatever anybody was worried about as far as the Paris commitment or the Clean Power Plan. Environmentally, this is going to be far superior than what was in the Clean Power Plan. So don't worry too much about giving up regulatory authority for something that was going to get revoked by the next Republican president anyway. And so I just want to give a shout out to my economist associate from Resources for the Future, Mark Hafstead, who did the emissions reductions calculations that Senator Whitehouse alluded to. I will just say there is an increasing body of peer-reviewed economic literature. We have something called the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. We do many multi-model analyses. We're doing one right now on policies that look very much like this legislation. I think we can say with increasing confidence that the scare scenarios about what this is going to do to the American economy are just wholly unfounded. I mean, we ran some models of a policy looking very similar to this. Basically, you get to the GDP you were going to get to anyway. So on a backdrop of a growing economic activity, you maybe get in 2050, you get where you were going to get a few months later than you otherwise would. I mean, really, this idea of devastation is a complete fabrication. So, the use of the revenue with pro-growth tax reform and assistance to households makes a ton of sense, both from the economic efficiency of the policy and the distributional outcomes. So I think there's a lot to like in this bill, and I also think there are a lot of dials that legislators can move up and down, whether it's the price trajectory or the use of the revenue or what happens with the regulatory authority. That is a lot of deal space, and I think it's very doable to have a productive and responsible engagement on those parameters, and I would love to see Republicans take this opportunity and take this sincere effort from Senators Whitehouse and Schatz very seriously. I also think it's wholly appropriate to target some of this revenue to the coal workers and coal-reliant communities. And I specifically appreciate that remark because there is no question that these folks are already hurting, largely as a matter of market trends in natural gas and renewable power. But I think this kind of legislation could be a real boost for folks who need it most. So I really like that. And I just want to emphasize that I think there's a lot to talk about in this bill, and there should be a lot of motivation on amongst conservatives to take it seriously.
Great. I know you're all itching to respond to each other. Veronique's already raised her hand twice. But let me start with Myron and Veronique. So, when I look at your argument, it's essentially there's a huge cost to doing something on like a carbon tax, right? There's a cost because it hurts workers, it hurts industries, it's going to make the US less competitive. And at the end of the day, the benefits are uncertain. And my question is, I would love for you to react to what Adele said and George said, but also, is there a trade-off that would work? Is there something in the bill that would say, yeah, we would go along with a carbon tax if we could also achieve this?
I'll start because I'm definitely the most ignorant on all this, but I will say that you hit the nail on the head, which is the thing that actually really shocks me about this conversation is like, we're talking about all the benefits, all the stuff we can get from this carbon tax in terms of tax reform, deregulation, all this goodies, but we're not talking about, will it actually work? Will it actually work? And when I read a lot of people who actually know what they're talking about, and I think there's a pretty wide consensus on the right and on the left that it's not going to deliver the result in terms of climate change. So then I want to say, shouldn't we actually be talking, because, and you're right, the issue is not going to go away. The issue of climate change is not going to go away. But you know what's great is because of the great education that's been done, consumers are asking for solutions. And businesses have proven that they want to fulfill this demand for greener energy, for greener ways of producing things. And so, yes, trade-offs, absolutely. Just show me that there's an actual real benefits, and then we can talk. But a lot of this panel has talked about all the goodies we can get, we conservatives, in terms of tax cuts, but I'd say like it doesn't matter if we're not getting changes in temperatures down the road, and this is why we're saying we're doing this.
Myron, do you want to respond to it?
Well, Veronique's point is a good one. The avoided warming by if the United States dropped its emissions next year to 0, it would avoid less than 0.2 of a degree centigrade of warming. Chinese emissions are now double those of the United States and continue to increase. A large part of Chinese emissions is the carbon leakage from Europe and to some degree the United States to China. Heavy manufacturing is now concentrated in China. But look at this country. California has reduced its emissions, but if you look at the carbon leakage that is, they used to assemble a lot of automobiles in California, for example. Well, they still buy automobiles, but they assemble them, they make them now in the heartland states where electricity is still inexpensive. So I think we already have a laboratory to see the economic impacts of these policies. California, despite the salesmanship of the current administration there, is an economic basket case. It has some incredible advantages, natural advantages, human advantages. It has Silicon Valley, it has entertainment, it has retirement possibilities. And yet, if you look at the productive economy, they are losing people in the middle class every single year. They've lost a huge number of people. Their tax base has been hollowed out. Germany now has electric rates 3 times those of the United States. And what is the result? Their emissions haven't gone down, but the standard of living of poor and lower class people is reaching dire levels. So I would say this really is another example of providing a policy that is all pain and no gain. I just make one more remark, Aparna. I mentioned, I contested Senator Schatz's claim that there was no increase in the regulatory overload. But I forgot to mention this border tax thing. That's going to require huge amounts of increase in bureaucracy to try to figure out which product comes from which country, and how much carbon dioxide was used to produce that product. And of course, very few products are now come from just one country. There's a whole chain of things. You know, the natural resource may come from one country, the material may be fabricated in another country. You know all this. And so this is a huge expansion of federal authority if we allow this to happen. And I think it has consequences far beyond that of just carbon dioxide, creating that kind of border wall that has to be with a million knobs on it that you're readjusting every minute.
Great. George and Adele.
Well, Veronique posed two-part question. Will it work? And I guess the question is, does a upstream carbon fee that's basically a tax swap work to actually reduce emissions? I mean, we do have quite a bit of experience over the last 35 or 40 years, and at least 20 years of modeling. We know that raising the price works in California, in the Northeast, in Europe, various other parts of the world. And we have 15 or 20 years of modeling showing that a price, an economy-wide price on CO2 emissions is going to produce 2 or 3 times more emissions reductions cheaper than regulation, than the Clean Power Plan would have. The second question is, does it work with respect to the economy? A tax swap, basically, again, it's modeling. You can't predict for sure, but almost all of the economic experience in the last 25 years and the modeling that's been done over the last 15 or 17 years shows that a tax swap where you use the money from an upstream fee to reduce corporate and individual income taxes or give individuals a credit of some kind through the tax system, either has zero long-term impact on GDP, those are the pessimistic people, or has a very significant impact in increasing GDP. So it actually grows the economy. And can you do this without a bureaucracy? There's no real bureaucracy involved in the kinds of things that this bill promotes, because we already tax coal and oil, so upstream, so it's a matter of putting another line on an existing IRS form, and you have a lower corporate tax rate, and you have credits on Social Security taxes or earned income tax credit. So there's no new bureaucracy to do a tax swap. So does a tax swap like this work? to grow the economy? Yes. Does it work to decrease emissions? Yes. Can it be done without a new bureaucracy? Yes. Now, Myron says, well, if the U.S. quits working on climate change altogether, it's probably not going to make all that much difference in the short run in global temperatures. That's right. We are reducing our emissions, and we are becoming a smaller part of the world. But the question is, do we want to? We've now put ourselves in the box with, Syria and Nicaragua. I suggested the other day that at a meeting like this that North Korea also was pointed out to me. No, North Korea did get into Paris. Their objection was it wasn't
they're
strong
your
enough.
ideal. They already
So
have
we're only there
zero
with we're only there
emissions.
with we're only there with Syria and Nicaragua. We want to stay there, but I don't think that represents making America great again. If you want to do this in an economically sound way, you grow the economy. Does it make companies more competitive? Sure, it does. Does it grow the economy? Yes. Can it be done without much of a bureaucracy? Yes. Does it create jobs? Yes. Does it stimulate new technologies? Yes. Does it allow Congress to have a firm basis to do permanent deregulation? Yes. So if those are the things you say you want, does it work to do those things? Yes, it does. Now, finally, one last thing you mentioned, of course, over time, as you reduce emissions, the tax reduces emissions, does the income stream reduce? Yes, but if you have a tax that starts at $25 or $35 and goes up 2% over inflation, 2% in real terms, for 20 or 25 years, it's pretty easy to model. So the income actually continues to rise for 25 or 28 years and doesn't actually even level off till the third decade. So this is not an income that's going to disappear. For the tax reform benefits, of course, Republicans want to do this through reconciliation. People understand this better than me, understand exactly why that has to be revenue neutral in the second decade. Carbon tax does that because unlike virtually all the other pay-fors that have been suggested, carbon tax not only gives you $2 trillion of new revenue in the first decade, it gives you $3 trillion in the second decade. So it even makes it possible for Republicans to do permanent tax reform through reconciliation.
But
It
again,
does all those things.
So
that's the reduction of carbon emission, which has already taken place quite dramatically, not thanks to a carbon tax in the last 40 years or whatever, because
Last
of
10
new
years.
innovation. Or when you look, it's quite significant. I mean, if it's like 1959 was the last highest level per capita. I mean, it's been going on and mostly due to shift towards green energy, which again, I contend people are demanding more green stuff. But so the question is like, is there a reduction in the temperature? Does it have an impact on temperature? That's the question. It's like, yes, of course you make the price of something, higher and you get, people will demand less of it. Does it have an impact on temperature? That should be the only debate we have, not what we can get, in exchange for putting in place a policy that will do one thing but not necessarily achieve the other. So that's all I'm asking.
I'll interject on that question. So Myron, you mentioned the 2-degree target and we know that the impact on the climate is a function of the overall stock of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that's emissions over a long period of time from all over the planet. So the damages are going to be a function of how much we emit, not just what we've done before, but what we're going to do from now on. So the more we limit the concentrations and eventually hopefully stabilize those concentrations, the more we limit the costs and damages associated with the climatic disruption and ocean acidification that are direct results of that. So, you keep talking about the cost of the action, but what about the cost of not acting? Really, are we going to threaten the Earth's climate? And some of these damage projections are quite significant. So there is a risk to manage. And let me explain why it's not just, yes, demand slopes downward. We put a price on carbon, our emissions will fall. This has been peer-reviewed up and down the wall, okay? There's no question about that. But it's in what are the spillovers from US action into the action by other countries that will actually result in the stabilization of those concentrations at a lower level than would occur without this policy. So let's go over that a couple ways. Number one, it will take diplomatic engagement. And that's why I keep going on about how diplomatically powerful is the policy that the US adopts. And again, if you go into this thing, well, we're not going to do anything federal, you're going to get a whole bunch of less efficient, less effective policies at subfederal levels. And therein lies one of the main problems with that is you have no diplomatic leverage. Second, or you have less, not none, it's not worthless, but it's definitely not to the level of a solid federal policy that we can point to. Second, think about the American capital markets unleashed on the technology that's going to become profitable when we actually price the costs of carbon pollution, right? Think of the American capacity for innovation in response to the profit motive. We have the deepest, richest, most liquid capital markets on the face of the earth, and when the United States puts its mind to this kind of technical challenge, which private capital markets will now have far greater incentive to engage in, think of the technologies that will then be developed, and they will be lower cost yet, and that will be the technology that enables other countries, including poor countries, to reduce emissions cost effectively and more ambitiously than they otherwise would. There's no substitute for the American economy being involved in this solution, right? And there's no substitute for market forces and free enterprise to be part of this solution. And there's no substitute for partnering with other market economies and our trading partners and competitors in this solution. So, I mean, when you say, why are we doing this now? Why weren't we doing this a long time ago, right? I mean, there's so many potential benefits and such a real threat that it boggles the mind why people who are conservative are still debating whether there's a case for action or not. I think we should be moving beyond that and talking about what the action actually is.
Exactly.
Adele, if I could answer that.
The question is not whether there's a case for action, is which action is going to lead to the right result. And to which I will ask you, I mean, I don't disagree with the importance of the US to be part of that solution. There's no doubt about this. There's no doubt about the importance of innovation as a solution to all of these problems. There's no doubt about that. The question is like, why, again, coming from a place of complete ignorance, why is it then that if this is a solution that brings about solution on climate, even the EPA models do not project this? Are these models incorrect?
I'm not sure which models you're talking about. That I'm very much integrated with the world of energy modelers and computable general equilibrium modelers. And, you know, we model this stuff all the time. And we model concentration stabilization scenarios, and we model domestic policies, and we model what are the effects of a unilateral policy on leakage in other economies. I mean, this is what we do
so
all
it'll
day.
change temperature down the road.
But
That's the only question I'm
Can I
asking.
ask a question?
Yeah.
What role do you assign American leadership in all this? Because I don't think this is just a matter of what our emissions impact is going to be on the temperature in Florida or sea level rise in Florida. Don't forget that the history of the Paris conference, 180 some countries agreeing to do some reasonably aggressive things. The history of that is that the United States, the Obama administration, which even after 3 or 4 years of Obama, you know, the U.S. was perceived as being somewhat of an outlier on climate action in the world, rightly or wrongly. But the American government made an initiative to agree with the Chinese government that together we would adopt some reasonably new, aggressive goals for the two biggest emitters in the world. That's what made Paris possible.
But
180 countries were willing to come together and do something together because the US and China took the lead. Without that, you wouldn't have many of these countries, perhaps even having come to the Paris conference, but certainly not having made the kinds of commitments that they made. So this is not just a matter of emissions in Detroit having an impact on Florida sea level rise. It's, you know, if you think that America has a leadership role in the world and shouldn't just stay with Nicaragua and Syria, then you have to really ask yourselves, what should we be doing that's good for our economy, that's good for the planet, but that's also good for world leadership? And taking the lead on a price on carbon is, you know, would be a leadership step on the part of the United States, unlike anything we've ever done
But George,
in the global environmental sphere.
You say that the U.S. and China made an agreement. The agreement was that the United States would continue to cut its emissions through energy rationing policies, and China would continue to increase its emissions at least till 2030. Now, their emissions are already twice ours, right? They're continuing to go up. Per capita Chinese emissions are now higher than per capita European Union emissions. So I don't see where the global leadership of the United States is getting us in terms of reducing emissions. I do think it's getting us somewhere in terms of hamstringing our economy, because unlike you, I don't believe that taxing the economy and making energy more expensive is a win-win-win-win-win-win-win, which is, I believe, all that I could tot up in your recitation of all the great things that come out of it. Can you provide any evidence that increasing taxes in this magnitude has ever led to an economic increase, an increase in economic output? I can't think of a single time when government takes out of the private economy for its own use dollars, it helps the economy.
A tax swap does not
No,
increase
this is
government
not a
spending.
tax swap.
Well, it is if you use the revenue to reduce other people's other taxes.
Well,
Just like cigarette taxes, you tax something and you reduce taxes.
A
on
very
the
small part of this is a tax swap. And I would like to see the anti-oligarchic leftist Democrats like Senator Whitehouse defend taking money out of the pockets of poor people and putting it in the hands of people who own shares in major U.S. corporations with a corporate tax decrease. I'd like to see that defend. The reason that's in there is because they want to lure some Republicans to front this effort. And that is not going to work, because although conservatives are the stupid party, they're not that stupid.
Well,
Okay, let's turn
I give
to
you that
audience
it's-
for questions.
I give you that it's a fair objection to proposals that have been made by many conservative economists and by the Bush, Baker, Paulson group for a revenue-neutral carbon tax swap. I give you that it's an objection to that it may be a good idea, but Congress will never do it, so we can't have it.
But do you
But the
deny-
concept certainly is a concept in which there's no new government spending.
Okay, Byron, I'm
Well,
going to have to
Yes.
turn to the
Yeah,
audience.
yeah,
They've
I'm
been
sorry.
very patient. We need to get them into the conversation. So let's start here. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah,
and
of course. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate the insight and the discussion. I'm Travis Harold. I'm with Dow. My question is about tax reform and the discussions around tax reform. So, we've seen, right, Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the administration, and we've seen them try to tackle, two pretty big issues such as the budget and health care, and we've known how that's been going. With that being said, I think there's something to be mentioned about the Republicans depending solely on their majority. With that being said, a higher level, obviously the proposal being brought up is interesting, but inviting Democrats to the conversation for tax reform at a much higher level. I mean, somehow, how does that happen? Does this proposal somewhat do that? I mean, I'm literally talking about getting them in the same room to discuss tax, because that's not happening right now. And so, you know, as imperative as tax reform is becoming, how do we get there? And does that proposal help that? Does this proposal help that happen? Et cetera. Thanks.
I think it can help that happen because it brings in a confluence of interests. Like any negotiation, you need wins amongst all the parties, right? So there are, I mean, we could write these right now. What are the winning talking points for Republicans? What are the winning talking points for Democrats? They're both there, they're just different. So okay, that's what creates space for a deal. I totally believe there's a deal to be made on tax reform. I think the kind of proposal that the senators put forward today is ready to grease the wheels of that deal.
And George, you mentioned that you were very hopeful.
I would say every Republican office, member or staff that we've talked to on the Senate Finance Committee will say, if we want to do real tax reform, permanent tax reform, we're going to need Democratic votes. It's going to have to be bipartisan. And that includes the chairman, who said that publicly, as well as privately. Does this have to be bipartisan? Yeah, it has to be bipartisan. That's one of the benefits and you know, one of the challenges.
What I would say is a lot of people who talk about tax reform, particularly in the Republican leadership, actually mean trying to figure out a way to convince the American public that they're reforming taxes, but what their goal is to increase federal revenues. I think some of the people in both the House and the Senate leadership are desperate to find more revenue, which in my view is not a conservative goal. I'd like to find less revenue and reduce the size of the federal government accordingly.
And bipartisanship rarely.
Actually, he raised
Right.
his hand first.
Right.
I would like to hear everybody's comparison.
Could you introduce yourself?
Cormac Close from Oberlin College. And I'm curious about the comparison between this proposal and proposals and legislation concerning sulfur dioxide emissions, concerning acid rain that were incredibly successful previously. We don't hear much about acid rain anymore. And that was a cap and trade permit program rather than a fee program. But I was wondering, especially Veronica and Byron, what your opinions were, like comparing this and that.
I have no idea.
Well,
I am not a climate person. I look at this, I really look at this in terms of, is this going to achieve, and that I can't come to that conclusion myself. I have to look at what other people respectable, like Ben Zeiker, are saying about the chance of achieving the ultimate result. What are the pros and cons of having a new source of revenue? As I absolutely cannot comment on other climate experiment have been done.
Yeah. Just very briefly, sulfur dioxide is a pollutant. It's not the necessary product of combustion. So CO2, if you burn a ton of coal, you're going to get 2.5 tons of CO2. But you don't necessarily have to get any sulfur dioxide. You can either use very low sulfur coal or you can take it out. The sulfur dioxide cap and trade program was not cheap because it was a cap and trade program. It was because it happened simultaneously with the deregulation of US railroads, which allowed low sulfur coal to be shipped from Wyoming to all of those big coal-fired power plants in the Mideast. And this is well documented. It's not a result of the program. It's a result of deregulation, not regulation.
I want to just bring out one point that I probably should have mentioned earlier with regard to sulfur dioxide. So we still have emissions of sulfur dioxide and mercury and nitrous oxides and particulate matters. One of the important outcomes of a carbon tax is to further reduce those pollutants. And there is a whole set of ancillary benefits to air quality and water quality and other environmental endpoints that would result from a reduction in the fossil fuels that would result from a carbon fee. So I think those ought to go into the benefits calculations, and they're not insignificant. They're actually a major part of the benefits of a program like this.
We have questions here.
David.
Let's
wait
let him
for
go
the- wait
first
for
and
the
then
mic.
next, yeah.
Fred Smith, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Since we've hit the question of the benefits of deregulation, one of the things we always say, what should we do if we don't buy the tax program? I think, generally speaking, the thing America can and should be doing for all kinds of purposes is trying to increase its own wealth and knowledge, technological achievement, and export as much of that to the world as possible. A richer, smarter world will be able to address all problems better, including climate change. But this program specifically, we mentioned earlier the investment tax, the border adjustment fees. We're in a world of extended stewardship responsibility. Supply chains go everywhere, and as Myron and others mentioned, they're massively complicated. And this program will entwine us in determining that and then engaging in micro understanding the sub-economies of all of our trading partners. I can imagine nothing more that would create regulatory imperialism charges against the United States, and also a potential tremendous amount of protectionist policies here and abroad. That part, at least, ought to be really thought. Simplified to the point where you don't have to do this external stuff.
You know, Canada is moving toward a $50 nationwide carbon price. And the reason they're doing it is because Canadian business community thinks that that's necessary to make Canada a richer, smarter country and compete in the world in an economy which is a much deeper hydrocarbon economy than the United States. So there's a neighbor, thinks rightly or wrongly, that doing a carbon tax, largely revenue neutral, is the way to become a richer, smarter country. Perhaps that would be true of the United States.
Well, we can wait
Let's
and see.
test that out. We'll try it. They go their way and we go our way, and we'll see how it works out. Ontario is now, which has always been the engine of Canada's economy, is now a net welfare recipient from the Canadian federal government, largely as a result of their energy policies, which have tripled and quadrupled electric prices and driven industry out of Ontario.
But you referred earlier to both California and Germany as basket cases, and I guess Ontario too. But from my point of view, I think those are some of the most prosperous, fastest growing places in the world.
I think you ought to look at the statistics, George.
Okay, next question.
Hi, David Bookbinder from the Scannon Center. I'd like the panelists to comment on the fact that last week 8 Republicans in California crossed the aisle to provide the necessary votes to pass the cap-and-trade system in California, led by the Republican leader in the California Assembly. Just like to hear your opinion.
So I actually have no doubts that Republicans are going to join the ranks, but they're not going to do it for the right reason. I think that one of the driver of more and more Republicans being interested in this idea of a carbon tax or is this issue of revenue, which is why I have to say I'm somewhat distressed by the way we're talking about this. And I think that there's a lot of Republicans that have internalized the fact that we're not going to cut entitlement, we're not going to reduce spending, and as such, revenue increases the solution. That seems to me like a terrible argument for a given policy, but yes, I am sure a lot of Republicans will join the ranks of those who are interested in grabbing that revenue.
Any other comments on?
Well, I don't necessarily see California Republicans as representative of Republicans in the U.S. Congress, so I don't know necessarily what to make of that. I do think, though, it points to an erosion of the monolithic obstructionism around climate policy within the Republican Party. And we're seeing this not just in California, in other states as well. I think Republicans are going to come to the conclusion that they need to be at the table, and their voices matter, and the conservative perspective has something valuable to offer in these important policy discussions. And so I think the time is right for Republicans to engage. And as I think I've made the case, waiting is not going to make it easier, and better to do it now and work from a position of strength.
Thanks. I'm Rachel McCormick, and I'm from the Embassy of Canada, so thank you, George, for opening up our policy priorities in Canada, which I have to say, first of all, BC has had a revenue-neutral carbon tax for over 10 years, and their economy's grown in that time, as well as decoupling emissions at the same time. So it's not just a case study, it's something that's happening in real life. And I think what was really interesting to me throughout the conversation, and I take your point that Veronique, we didn't get to talk about everything, but it's a big topic, and so we're not going to hit every nail on the head through this conversation. But what was really interesting to me is that Adele really focused on the incentive aspect and the innovation aspect. And I think one of the reasons that corporations in Canada are very interested in this approach is that it provides certainty. There's a pathway in terms of pricing. It allows flexibility. It gives them the option to reduce emissions in the way that makes most sense for them. It's not an end-of-pipe solution. It's not a technology-driven solution that somebody else is imposing on them or a specific cap. They choose, based on their business model, how to meet what the market's signaling. And I think a big drive in terms of Canada's commitment on this front is about incenting innovation in a long-term transformation. And for us, the revenues are actually staying in the provinces, and provinces decide how their economies need it to transition to a future economy, a strong economy, and one that actually delivers jobs as that transition happens. And so I guess the question is not just, does this deliver the results that you're going to have, but if you're not for regulation and you're not for pricing, what policy is going to get us there? Because instead of saying what's wrong with the policy, let's talk about a policy that is going to get us there.
Rachel, can I ask you a question? What is the percentage of British Columbia's electric production from fossil fuels? It's pretty close to zero, isn't it?
Not in British Columbia,
Yeah.
In Quebec, yes, but British Columbia is...
It's very low because it's almost all hydropower, and always has been.
Well,
right?
in BC, but Alberta is also...
So what a carbon tax is in British Columbia is essentially just raising the gas tax, the gasoline tax on
British
cars.
Columbia actually has quite a bit of natural gas power. Most of our hydro is out east with Quebec and Ontario and New Brunswick, but BC does have some.
Well, let me just answer very briefly my answer to your question about innovation. The biggest innovation in the energy sector in the past generation was the shale oil and gas revolution, which government didn't have anything to do with.
That's not quite true.
Now, hang on. Look, have you ever talked to the people who made that revolution? George Mitchell tinkered for 30 years combining technologies when everybody said it wouldn't work. And it worked. We now have the world's largest supplies of fossil fuels, not just coal. It is as President Trump said, it is in the United States' national interest to become the world's dominant energy producer and to give our manufacturers an energy price advantage that no other country in the world can compete with. That is what will cause innovation. As Fred said, increased wealth, not more taxes, not more government, increased wealth will create innovation, and it will multiply on itself. And so that is the course that we are now on. And all of the arguments for why we need a carbon tax to replace other things that conservatives don't like went poof on November 8th.
Okay, we have time.
One thought on that is energy and carbon are not the same thing. We can be energy dominant without being carbon dominant. And that's the key to setting the right market signals. So let's be clear about that. And let's talk about wealth. What about natural capital? What about our ecological wealth and our environmental resources? there's any sensible estimate of the nation's wealth would include natural capital. So I think, maybe it's not the easiest to monetize, but it's critically important to sustaining our economy.
Adele, do you deny that the wealthiest countries have the
Okay,
most natural capital?
Let's do one last question.
One last question.
There at the back, all the way.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jason Lee. I'm from the Environmental Defense Fund. I'd like to ask a little bit, the panel, to talk a little bit more about distributive impacts. I think both the right and the left can agree that impacts on lower income, on middle class, are critical to any public policy, really. And I'd like in particular to respond to a comment or a couple of comments that were made earlier about the impacts of a carbon tax, or this proposal being felt most harshly on the lower classes, which I find frankly, a little disingenuous. A lot of the research has found, or all the research that I found, finds that the taxes are regressive if none of the revenue is recycled. And it's regressive on a percentage basis in terms of how much is being paid on a raw amount. The higher income classes actually pay more. And that means on the flip side that when the rebate comes, the raw amount means more to the lower classes. So the rebate makes the tax proposal become progressive. One of the studies was done by the Office of Tax Analysis, Department of Treasury, and they find, using actual tax returns, that the consumption baskets of the different income deciles means that the carbon tax is more of a raw amount payment from the higher classes and turns into a rebate that means more to the lower classes. I was wondering if the panel could comment more on the distribution and what this means for the political viability of a carbon tax.
You asked two world experts.
So I'm laughing because one of those studies is by Aparna and me. And for a really
Great
nice lit
question.
review, look at chapter 6 of a book I co-edited called Implementing a U.S. Carbon Tax. There's a big literature on this, and Aparna runs all the best models on this in terms of impacts on consumers and following price signals into consumption bundles. So it's something we know something about, and I think that the bill has illustrated one way to try to balance the efficiency gains through the tax swap and then the rebates to households. There are different ways to do that, and that's why that is part of the deal space. And I think Veronique brought up wisely that reducing corporate income taxes actually has some benefit to workers, right? And so it's not like it only benefits shareholders, it's going to benefit workers as well. So you need to look at all of that holistically in terms of the broader tax package that would go with this price on carbon.
Great, thank you so much.
If I can just add one more thing though, yes, sure, but I actually am not sold on the idea that it's a good trade-off for conservatives to get a new source of revenue through the carbon tax in exchange for a tax reduction, which has been proven by many models, including AI, that over time the revenue impact is made up by the economic growth. So basically, we're exchanging a tax revenue that would have actually kind of grown over time. Granted, it's over time for a new source of revenue. I don't think that's a great deal to make. I'm all in favor of getting rid of the corporate income tax for all the reasons, including really higher wage for low workers. And I'm in favor of absolutely finding the right ways to address climate issues if there's a consensus on this. Which again, I'm an economist. I don't work on these issues, and I certainly wouldn't claim to know what I'm talking about. So.
Clearly, this debate is going to continue. Please thank me in joining. Please
you.
join me in thanking the panelists.